There are wounds that don't bleed, yet cut deeper than any blade. I was once called worthless by my in-laws, cast out of their house simply because I couldn't bear children. All I had in my hands then was a small suitcase and 23 crumpled dollars. But I rose again step by step, piece by piece, reborn from the ashes. And on the day I returned, I was no longer the abandoned woman. I was the woman who had it all: a thriving career, true love, and a complete family. This is the story of my journey from despair to triumph, from being dismissed to rewriting with my own hands the very definition of happiness. Chapter 1. The Tragedy Begins. My name is Sarah. If someone had told me that one day my life would collapse just because I couldn't have children, I would have scoffed. But life has a cruel way of drowning you in the deepest abyss of despair right at the moment you believe you're standing firm. It all began in Dr. Rodriguez's office. I can still remember how my hands trembled as I clutched Jordan's, my husband's, hand. The test results lay before us, thin yet unbearably heavy. The doctor looked at me with pity and delivered a verdict. Your chances of conceiving are nearly non-existent. There is still hope, but it's very slim. In that instant, I saw Jordan's eyes go blank. He didn't look at me, didn't squeeze my hand even once more. He just nodded, his face as cold as stone. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I would have to fight, but I never imagined that the man who once vowed to share joy and sorrow with me would remain so silent. We returned to his family's grand house. The moment we stepped inside, my mother-in-law, Scarlet, immediately asked, "What did the results say?" There was no concern for my health in her voice, only the pressing expectation of a grandchild. Jordan poured himself a glass of wine and replied calmly, "It'll be harder than we thought. The problem lies with Sarah." I froze at the word problem. I was not some broken machine in need of repair. I was a human being, a woman whose dream of motherhood had been stolen. Yet to Jordan and his family, I was nothing more than an obstacle. Scarlet pressed her lips together, her eyes first flashing disappointment, then hardening into disdain. Setting a vase back onto the table, she said coldly, "A woman without children is no different from a barren tree." That sentence cut deep into my heart. I tried to speak up. "We'll find a way. There are many medical options." But she turned away, leaving me with nothing but Amanda's, the sister-in-law's, pitying glance. That night, Jordan lay beside me, but the distance between us on that vast bed was wider than any ocean. He didn't say a word. I turned to him and whispered, "We'll get through this." His only reply was flat, "We'll see." The following days, breakfast became a silent tribunal. Scarlet mentioned a friend who had just welcomed twin grandchildren. Amanda laughed brightly, saying she was sure she'd conceive right after marriage. Meanwhile, I sat quietly pushing food around my plate, swallowing each cruel word like poison. Time passed, each month a new disappointment, each negative pregnancy test another wound. I hid the test sticks deep in the trash so no one could see my failures. Jordan stopped accompanying me to the hospital altogether, claiming he was too busy with meetings and work. But the truth was simpler. He just couldn't bear to face me, the wife he believed had let him and his family down. One evening, I gathered my courage and suggested, "What if we thought about adoption?" Jordan didn't even look up. His answer was curt. "Mother wants a blood grandchild. You know that." In that moment, I no longer felt like his wife. I was just a defective tool of reproduction, a name whispered with shame whenever my failures were mentioned. The true breaking point came one afternoon in March. My period was a few days late, sparking a fragile flame of hope within me. I bought a test, held my breath, and waited. And then, just one line again, I collapsed onto the bathroom floor, sobbing until I could barely breathe. These were no longer quiet tears, but the raw cries of a soul mourning the loss of its greatest dream. When I finally dragged myself downstairs, my face still streaked with tears, I found Jordan in his study. On his desk were not company files, but a neat stack of divorce papers. He looked at me with calm eyes. even a hint of relief. Sarah, we both know this marriage has lost its meaning. I stood frozen, trembling all over. Just hours earlier, I had begged fate for one more chance. And now my husband, the man who once promised to weather every storm with me, was ready to discard me like a broken possession. That was the moment I realized the nightmare had only just begun. Chapter 2. Cast Aside. I once thought that no matter how cold Jordan became, he was still my husband. He would hesitate before throwing me out, but I was wrong. He hadn't just prepared the divorce papers. Tucked inside them was the prenuptial agreement I had signed 3 years ago. Those cold, merciless lines safeguarded the Harrison family's fortune and ensured that I would leave with nothing. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Jordan avoided my eyes and simply said, "We want different things, Sarah. You want a family. I want a family that can survive. I need my own blood." A bitter laugh caught in my throat. "You talk as if I never wanted that." But I tried. I hoped every single day. His only response was a shake of the head, as if love no longer had any meaning at all. Scarlet appeared right then, as if she had been eavesdropping the whole time. She wasn't angry, she didn't shout. Her voice was calm, but sharp as a blade. "Sarah, you should pack tonight. Amanda will call a taxi to take you away. You're still young, you have more chances ahead. Jordan can't waste any more time." I stood frozen. I looked at Jordan, praying he would object, that he would say his mother had gone too far. But he quietly gathered the divorce papers into a folder, as though everything had already been decided. That night, I packed my belongings in the room I once called my own. 3 years of marriage reduced to a single suitcase. I folded my wedding dress, the symbol of a love I had once believed eternal, and tucked it at the very bottom, my hands trembling all the while. Scarlet stood at the doorway, her cold eyes watching every move I made. "You're still young," she said, her tone dripping with false kindness. "You'll find someone else who can accept your limitations." I gripped the handle of my suitcase, tightly swallowing the humiliation. Amanda walked in, handing me a coat and my purse. "The taxi's here. Time to go." She didn't even look at me, her voice as light as if she were dismissing an unwanted guest. Just before I stepped out the door, Scarlet opened her wallet, pulled out a few bills, exactly $23, and shoved them into my hand. "For the ride. That's all you'll ever get from this family." The door shut behind me with a dry final click. I stood there in the vast courtyard, my suitcase heavy in my hand, while inside I felt hollow. The taxi was waiting, its yellow headlights casting their glow across my tear-stained face. I climbed in, too afraid to look back. The driver glanced at me in the rear-view mirror and asked, "Where to?" I stayed silent. I had no home, no money, no one waiting. I whispered, "Just drive." The car pulled away, carrying me from the manicured fences of the mansion, where I had once imagined raising children and building a family. My tears fell freely, sinking into the worn leather seats. Yet amid that pain, a faint ember burned inside me. They thought they had destroyed me. They believed I would vanish quietly. But they were wrong. That night, I ended up at a shabby roadside motel. The room reeked of cigarette smoke, the sheets were wrinkled, and the pipes dripped endlessly. I set my suitcase down, collapsed onto the stiff mattress, and looked around at the empty 4 walls. My entire life had been reduced to this. I wept. But this time, through the bitter tears, I whispered to myself, "They don't get to decide your worth. Sarah, you will rise again. One day they will bow their heads when they see you." And within that cheap little room, a vow was born, a vow that I would never again allow anyone to trample me underfoot. Chapter 3. Freefall and Survival. The first morning after being cast out, I woke on the rock-hard bed of a cheap motel. The sickly yellow light from the ceiling bulb spilled across the stain-peeling walls. I sat there staring at the single suitcase in the corner, realizing that my entire life now fit into one portable box. In my pocket were the exact $23 Scarlet had shoved at me, plus a handful of coins scraped from the bottom of my purse. No home, no job, no family waiting with open arms. I was nothing more than the discarded. That day, I walked for hours, partly to search for work, partly to silence the despair gnawing at me. I stopped in front of a small laundromat with a scribbled help wanted sign in the window. Drawing in a deep breath, I stepped inside and asked for a job. The owner, a Latina woman, looked me over my worn-down heels, my wrinkled business attire. I lied, saying I had retail experience. She was silent for a few moments, then handed me a faded apron. $6 an hour. Cash. You start now. And so from someone who once lived in the Harrison mansion, I found myself behind the counter of a laundromat, tagging the expensive coats of strangers. I remember my hands trembling as I brushed against cashmere, the fabric reminding me of the days I used to carefully hang such garments in my own cavernous closet. Now I was nothing more than the one serving others. At lunch, I sat in a cramped break room eating a cold sandwich bought with advance pay. Staring into the restroom mirror, I barely recognized the hollow face, the red-rimmed eyes. Tears spilled over, but I wiped them away quickly. I knew that if I kept crying, I'd never lift my head again. That night, I rented a tiny room in a crumbling housing block. The landlord eyed me suspiciously, a woman with no proof of stable employment. I handed him 2 months' rent in cash, praying he'd accept. After a long stare, he nodded. I finally had a place to call home, a shabby room with a leaky faucet and a window that wouldn't quite shut. I bought an old mattress from a thrift shop and dragged it up 3 flights of stairs with the last of my strength. That night, I sat on the floor eating instant noodles with a bent fork left behind by the previous tenant. I whispered to myself, "It's only temporary. Sarah, you will survive," but temporary stretched into weeks. The laundromat paid too little to cover rent and food, so by day I worked there, and by night I took on a janitorial job. Cleaning office buildings. I scrubbed toilets, emptied trash bins stuffed with crumpled papers, wiped down dust-covered desks. The stench of bleach clung to my hands until the skin cracked and bled. On weekends, I picked up catering shifts at weddings through an events company. I carried trays of wine through crowds dressed in ball gowns and tailored suits. More than once I recognized familiar faces, Jordan's friends. Their eyes flickered with surprise, then quickly pretended not to know me. My heart ached, but I kept smiling, setting glasses down like an invisible servant. Some nights I was so exhausted I collapsed asleep on the floor, still in uniform. The owner of the little bookstore near the laundromat, where I often bought discounted books, quietly left granola bars and coffee on the counter whenever she noticed me growing thinner. Those small kindnesses saved me in the darkest of days. Though weary, I refused to collapse. Every evening, staring into the cracked mirror of my shabby apartment, I reminded myself, "They think you're finished. But one day, Sarah, you will rise stronger than ever, and when that day comes, they will regret underestimating you." In that cramped room, I swore to myself today's humiliation would become tomorrow's fuel. I didn't yet know how, but I would return, not merely to survive, but to live and to conquer. Chapter 4. The First Glimmer. 3 months after being cast out of the Harrison house, I had become little more than a shadow. By day, I worked at the laundromat. In the afternoon, I squeezed in a few hours at the small bookstore, and by night I scrubbed offices until nearly dawn. I slept 3 or 4 hours a day, surviving on instant noodles and cheap coffee, but at least I was still surviving. That morning, after finishing a night shift, I was so drained I could barely think. I ducked into a small bakery to grab some coffee. As I hurriedly wiped a spill off my shirt, I bumped into a man sitting in the corner. I stammered an apology, then looked up. I froze. It was Raj Patel, my old neighbor from Maple Street, where I had grown up. Years ago, I had helped his mother when she fell on the front steps. More than a decade had passed, and yet he recognized me instantly. "Sarah Mitchell!" He exclaimed, his face lighting up with surprise and joy. "My God, I thought I'd never see you again." We sat and talked. Raj told me he had built a small logistics company managing cargo shipments. When I vaguely mentioned that I was looking for new opportunities, he paused, studying me closely. I need an operations manager, he said. It's demanding, requires organization and quick problem solving. I think you'd be good at it. I let out a strained laugh. Raj, I'm working at a laundromat, a bookstore, and cleaning offices. I know nothing about logistics. He smiled, his eyes unwavering. What I see isn't your current job. I see the girl who once helped someone without hesitation. I see the woman still standing, even after life dragged her to the bottom. Logistics is about managing people and problems. You've already been doing that. You just don't realize it yet. He slid me his business card. Come by the office on Monday. Just give it a try. That night, in my shabby little room, the card lay before me like a tiny beacon in the dark. I made a choice. I would risk it. I spent the entire weekend devouring free logistics material, watching tutorials online, scribbling notes into the night. Each page, each line was a lifeline I clung to. On Monday morning, I put on the only business outfit I had, left a faded blouse from my days in the Harrison house, and walked into Patel Logistics. It was just a modest office, a few desks, a whiteboard, and 3 busy employees. But to me, it looked like a door to the future. Raj introduced me to the team, then placed a stack of files on the desk. Start by reading through these contracts. Organize the data so it's easier for everyone to access. I dove into the work like a thirsty soul discovering a well. I spent the whole day at the computer, entering data categorizing building spreadsheets. That night at home, I kept researching ways to streamline processes. Within 2 weeks, I had created an automated tracking system, using spreadsheets saving hours of manual work. The colleagues who had once eyed me with doubt now came asking for advice. For the first time in months, I felt valuable. I was no longer the woman branded a fruitless tree, no longer the outcast shoved out the door with nothing but a suitcase. I was Sarah, a woman who could make a difference. That night back in my tiny apartment, I sat on the thin mattress, clutching the business card Raj had given me. What I felt was more than relief. It was strange, powerful. This was not just a job. It was the first glimmer proof that the darkness surrounding me was finally beginning to lift. I whispered to myself, this is only the beginning. Chapter 5. Learning and Building. When I began working at Patel Logistics, I knew I was holding a chance I couldn't afford to lose. Raj trusted me, and slowly my colleagues came to respect me. But deep inside, I understood something crucial. If I remained just an employee, I would always live in fear of scarcity. I needed more. I needed to learn how to build a foundation of my own, something solid, something lasting. It started one afternoon as I ate a quick sandwich at my desk. Maria, a younger coworker, scrolled through her phone and casually boasted I made an extra $300 this month just by investing through an app. Money comes in while I do nothing. Her words stunned me. I had never thought of money as something that could grow. That night, instead of collapsing into sleep after another long day, I opened my old laptop and began studying finance. I read articles, watched videos, joined forums. I learned the basics: saving, compound interest, long-term investing. A lecturer in one video said something I would never forget. Your money must have children, and those children must bear grandchildren. I started small. Each paycheck I set aside $50 into an index fund. It wasn't much, but it gave me the sense that I was taking back control of my life. Every time I saw the account balance rise even just a little, it felt like reclaiming a fragment of power I thought I'd lost. But I didn't stop there. I enrolled in online courses, business management, even entrepreneurship. At lunch breaks, instead of chatting, I buried myself in readings. At night, I filled notebooks with notes, ideas, charts. I was like a parched wanderer in the desert who had finally discovered a spring. At work, I applied everything I learned. I noticed several shipping routes were consistently losing money. I began gathering data-building cost analysis charts. 2 weeks later, I presented Raj with a plan to reduce losses. He looked at me first, surprised, then smiling. Sarah, this is excellent. You're changing this company. Those words touched the deepest hunger within me, the hunger to be valued not for the children I could or couldn't bear, but for my mind and my true worth. 3 months later, Raj gave me my first significant bonus. My hands shook as I held the check. I didn't buy clothes. I didn't take a trip. I invested the entire sum into a green tech startup. The risk was high, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I felt free. Not every investment succeeded. Once I lost nearly half my savings on the wrong project. I cried through the night, but the next morning I opened my notebook and studied where I had gone wrong. I learned to accept failure, but never to let failure silence me. One rainy afternoon, staring at the flickering numbers on the screen, I suddenly remembered myself years ago, the woman clutching a suitcase, thrown out of a mansion, left with nothing but $23. A bitter smile touched my lips. If Charlotte and Jordan could see me now, they would never believe that the fragile Sarah had learned to turn scraps of wages into the first bricks of a new fortress. I began to dream bigger, not just survival, but wealth enough that no one could ever touch me again. Strength enough that if the day came when we met face to face, I could hold my head high. And I knew this road had only just begun to open before me. I made myself a promise, Sarah, never again will anyone strip you of your choices. From this moment on, your life belongs to you. Chapter 6, Success and Soaring High. Just 1 year after starting at Patel Logistics, my life was unrecognizable. I was no longer the exhausted woman clutching a suitcase in a smoke-stained motel. I now had a steady job, a small but tidy apartment, and, most importantly, a new belief that I could shape my own future. I remember vividly the day Raj called me into his office and handed me an envelope with the largest bonus I had ever received. He said, "Sarah, you've helped the company increase productivity by over 30%. You deserve much more than this." My hands trembled as I held the check. For the first time in my life, I had enough money to truly change my future. I didn't spend it on clothes or vacations. I invested it all. I devoured reports, analyzed markets, and studied risk assessment. Then came the opportunity, a biotech company researching infertility treatments. Ironically, the very field that had once shattered my marriage became the greatest chance of my life. I invested. And 18 months later, that investment quadrupled. In a single morning, I realized I had leapt from survival to wealth. I sat staring at the numbers flashing on my account, my heart pounding. The woman who once lived on instant noodles in a dingy apartment now held hundreds of thousands of dollars. I kept going. I diversified my portfolio green tech software, promising startups. Not every investment succeeded, but the wins outweighed the losses, strengthening my foundation. The day I officially crossed the $1 million mark, I simply sat before the screen in silence. I didn't scream or jump in joy. I only whispered, "Charlotte, you should never have underestimated me." But for me, money was never just money. Money was freedom. Money was power, the kind that meant I would never again have to kneel for scraps of pity. So I made a bold move. I invested in a private jet management company. The sum was so large my hands shook as I signed the contract. Yet it gave me more than returns. It gave me access to private flights. I'll never forget my first flight. Stepping onto the gleaming jet with its supple leather seats and wide windows opening onto the sky, I sat down, fastened my belt, and felt my heart race. I remembered that night years ago, riding in a taxi with nothing but a suitcase, not knowing where to go. And now I could go anywhere I wished. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the shrinking city beneath me. Tears welled up, not from sorrow, but from sheer joy. I whispered, "Sarah, you're truly flying now." From that moment, my life entered a new chapter. No longer counting pennies to survive, I began thinking about building a legacy, not just wealth, but influence. I attended conferences, networked with entrepreneurs, listened, and learned. I started writing down a vision. One day, I wouldn't just be an investor. I would be a founder, a leader for women who, like me, had once been struck down. One night after returning from a flight, I sat alone in the luxurious apartment I had just rented. A glass of wine in hand, I gazed at the glittering city outside my window. My thoughts drifted to Jordan, to Charlotte, to that night I was cast out with nothing but $23, and I smiled. They thought they had broken me, but in truth, the very moment they slammed that door shut, they opened the sky above me. Chapter 7. New Love and a Miracle. When I had money and status, I thought I had everything. But on quiet evenings in my luxurious apartment, I realized that all I had around me were numbers, reports, and investment charts. I was wealthy yet utterly alone. One weekend, I decided to try something different. I applied for a part-time job at a small neighborhood cafe. I didn't need the money, I needed people. Ordinary conversations that weren't about profits or deals. The owner, an elderly woman, looked me over and said, "You look like someone who's forgotten how to enjoy life. This place will remind you." At first I was clumsy, spilling coffee, mixing up cappuccinos and lattes. But in that simple little shop, I felt lighter. I wasn't a millionaire there. I was just Sarah, a barista, learning how to smile again. And it was there that I met Christian. Every Saturday morning, he sat in the corner reading a book, always ordering the same thing, a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. He was nothing like the men I had known before. No arrogance, no rush. His eyes were gentle, his hands warm as they turned the pages. I remember the first time I spilled coffee on his table. Flustered, I apologized, but he just smiled. "It's fine. I'm not in a hurry." Simple words. Yet they touched the deepest part of me, the part that had only known how to run, prove it, and endure. We began talking more. He told me he was a social worker at a children's center. His income wasn't large, but his heart was. When I asked why he chose such difficult work, he said, smiling, "Because I was once an orphan. I know what it's like to be abandoned. Now I want to be a shelter for children like me." I was stunned. For the first time in years, I met someone who didn't see me through the lens of wealth or fertility. He saw me. One autumn evening, as golden leaves fell across the park, I told Christian everything. About Jordan, about Charlotte, about the night I was thrown out with just a suitcase. I thought he might pity me or be shocked, but he simply held my hand and said softly, "You're not weak. You survived. You were reborn. To me, you're the strongest woman I've ever known." I broke down in tears, not from pain, but because for the first time in my life, someone saw my true worth. Our love grew in the gentlest way. No drama, no spectacle. We cooked together, walked in the park, shared the smallest details of our days. I had never known peace like that. A year later, Christian proposed, not with a massive diamond, but with a simple, elegant ring, and a promise, "I love you for who you are, not your past, not your wealth. Just you." I said yes. We were married in a small ceremony at City Hall. No prestigious guests, only genuine happiness. And then came the miracle. One morning I felt different. My hands trembled as I bought a pregnancy test, too afraid to hope. But then 2 pink lines appeared. I sat down on the floor, sobbing in disbelief. I thought of all the negative tests of the past, of Charlotte's cruel words cutting into me. And now, when I was no longer under pressure, when I had real love, the impossible had happened. 9 months later, I held my son in my arms. We named him Thomas, a new beginning, a miracle born from love. As I looked at Christian, his eyes brimming with tears, I whispered, "I am no longer a barren tree. I am an entire garden." Chapter 8. The Fateful Invitation. Life has a strange way of circling back. After Thomas was born, I slowly withdrew from the whirlwind of relentless investing. I still ran my business, but my true joy came from being a mother and building a simple, steady happiness with Christian. I no longer thought of Jordan or Charlotte. They were just an old nightmare, long closed. But one morning, while checking my inbox, a name appeared that made my heart skip: Amanda Harrison. My chest tightened. It had been 4 years since the day they threw me out, and just as long since I had heard a single word from that family. With trembling hands, I opened the email. The subject line read, Invitation Women's Leadership Gala. Exclusive guest list. Amanda's tone was polished and formal, praising my firm, Mitchell Strategic Consulting, as a rising women-led enterprise nominated to attend their annual fundraising gala. The invitation was embossed, stamped, and carried Amanda's own signature at the bottom. I couldn't help but laugh. Amanda had no idea the woman she was inviting was the very same Sarah Mitchell she once ushered to the curb with nothing but a suitcase and 23 crumpled dollars. To her, I was just another name, perhaps recognized from Business Weekly, where they had recently profiled me as a promising face among women entrepreneurs. Yet what struck me wasn't the invitation itself. It was the location, the Harrison estate, the very mansion where they had once stood coldly watching me leave, the place I had sworn I'd never return to. I sat in silence for a long time. Christian came in and saw me frozen before the screen. "What is it?" he asked. I showed him the email. He read it, then looked up with quiet understanding. "You don't have to go. No one can force you to face the past." I nodded slightly. But deep inside, another feeling stirred. Not anger, but curiosity. I wanted to see Charlotte's face when she realized I was no longer the fragile woman they cast out, but someone who had rebuilt her life from ashes. I wanted to see Jordan's eyes when he recognized what he had thrown away, something he could never have back. That night, after putting Thomas to sleep, I sat with Christian on our porch, the warm light falling across his face. I said softly, "I'm not going back for revenge. I'm going to close the circle. I want them to see how well I've lived without them." Christian was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "If you go, we go together. This is our family, not theirs. And Thomas will be there too, as living proof that you've already won." My eyes blurred with tears. He always knew how to place me exactly where I belonged, not as a survivor, but as a victor. I typed my reply, delighted to attend. "I will be bringing my family." The week leading up to the gala, I prepared carefully. I chose a deep, midnight blue silk gown, elegant but understated. Christian arranged the car and contacted the private jet service in which I now held shares. We decided we would arrive at the gala by private plane. No words needed, our presence would be statement enough. The night before our departure, I sat watching Thomas sleep, his soft hair spread across the pillow. I whispered, "You are the most beautiful answer I could ever give to every cruel word they once hurled at me." And I knew tomorrow, when I stepped once more into the house that had cast me out, I would not be the same woman. I would return as the brightest version of myself, a wife, a mother, a business leader, and most importantly, a free woman. Chapter 9. The Fateful Confrontation. The limousine rolled slowly up the long drive to the Harrison estate. I sat quietly, my hand intertwined with Christian's, an unfamiliar calm settling in my heart. No trembling, no fury. I had come too far for this night to be about revenge. It was about proof that I had lived and lived far better than they ever imagined. The car door opened. I stepped out, first flashes of cameras sparking like lightning. Strangers stared, not recognizing my face, yet the confidence in my stride made it clear I was someone who mattered. Christian followed, holding little Thomas in a tiny suit with a blue bow tie that matched my gown. The three of us looked complete, like a portrait of wholeness. I lifted my gaze to the house I once knew so well. The gray-tiled roof, the glowing windows, the stone steps I had once climbed alone in despair. Tonight I returned not as the outcast, but as the guest of honor. Inside the grand hall I saw him, Jordan. He was chatting with a group of men, a glass of wine in hand. The moment his eyes found me, his entire face froze. The glass nearly slipped from his fingers. Shock, disbelief, then raw pain flickered across his features. He stammered, "Sarah, you..." I smiled lightly, my voice steady. "Hello, Jordan. I was invited here, as my company is part of the Women's Leadership Initiative. Quite the coincidence, isn't it? His gaze snapped to Thomas, our son's bright smile, so like Christian's. But with my eyes, I saw Jordan's throat tighten, but before he could speak, Charlotte appeared. She had aged, deep lines carved into her once proud face. When she saw me, she faltered, gripping Jordan's arm for support. "Sarah," she whispered, as if she were seeing a ghost. I nodded politely. "Good evening, Charlotte. The house looks just as beautiful as ever." Behind her, Amanda stepped forward, guest list in hand. When her eyes landed on me, her complexion drained. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. She stammered, I didn't realize Mitchell Consulting was..." I gave her a small smile. "It's me. Mitchell was my name before I married Jordan. After the divorce, I returned to it. Simple, really." The air thickened with silence. Guests turned curious eyes toward us, but none knew the whole story. Charlotte's gaze flickered to Thomas, her eyes trembling. "This child..." Christian gently squeezed my hand before replying with calm certainty, "Thomas, our son, all three of them." Jordan, Charlotte, Amanda stood stunned. I could see the calculations racing in their minds, lining up years and dates before the realization struck. I had gained what they once swore I never would: a child, a family. I bent down to adjust Thomas's tiny collar, then looked up and smiled directly at Charlotte. "Do you remember when you called me a barren tree? Tell me, what do you see now?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. Amanda's cheeks flushed crimson, while Jordan stood motionless, his eyes drowning in unspoken regret. I didn't need to say more. My presence with my husband and son was the sharpest response imaginable. No shouting, no accusations. Just us, whole, joyful, victorious, while their world cracked in silence. 2 hours later, we departed the gala. I walked down the same stone steps where years ago I had set down a small suitcase. This time I descended in heels that echoed with pride, my son asleep in Christian's arms, my heart overflowing with freedom. In that moment, I knew the circle had closed. The past no longer held power over me. I was no longer the abandoned woman. I was Sarah, a woman reborn. Chapter 10, Closure and Rebirth. After that gala, I felt a lightness I had never known. It wasn't triumph, nor the thrill of revenge. It was peace, like finally setting down an invisible suitcase I had been carrying for years. I no longer felt the need to look back. Jordan, Charlotte, and Amanda no longer held any power to make my heart tighten. They were simply figures in a closed chapter while I had turned the page. One morning, as I cooked breakfast, Christian walked in with a gentle smile. "You look different, Sarah." Lighter, I smiled back. "You're right. I feel like I've stepped out of a long shadow. Now I just want to live for this family and for the women out there who've been cast aside like I once was." That thought grew into determination. I remembered those nights on a worn mattress, eating instant noodles, crying in despair. How many women were still living that same story, abandoned, dismissed, stripped of everything. Just because a marriage had ended, I didn't want them to endure that journey alone. So I founded the Phoenix Foundation, named for the bird that rises from ashes. Its mission was simple, yet powerful, to help women rebuild their lives after divorce. At first, we offered only small programs, financial management classes, resume workshops, job connections. But soon, dozens, then hundreds of women came. They wept in my office, recounting nights of being left behind, the last coins in their wallets, the humiliation of returning to their parents' home empty-handed. Looking at them, I saw my former self. Each time the foundation helped a woman land a job, rent her first apartment, or open a small savings account, my heart stitched itself back together a little more. I knew then this was my purpose, to turn my pain into a torch for others. Thomas grew up among those stories. He took his first steps in the foundation's office, stacking blocks beside mothers, receiving financial counseling. To us, he was living proof that hope could bloom even in barren soil. Once I spotted a familiar name on the list of applicants, Jennifer Harrison Jordan's cousin. My breath caught. She had just divorced, left with 2 small children. She likely didn't know her application would land on my desk. I thought long and hard, then decided to help her without ever mentioning our connection to the Harrison family. Because this foundation wasn't built for revenge, but for second chances. 2 years later, Jennifer stood at one of our gatherings smiling with happiness. She had become one of Phoenix Foundation's greatest success stories. Watching her, I felt a deep, quiet peace. On Thomas's 4th birthday, we held a small backyard party. Children ran and laughed in the garden. Christian stood by the grill grinning, and I sat watching, my eyes misting. This was true wealth. Not the cold numbers in an account, but warmth, community, love. Christian turned to me and asked, "Do you regret anything about the past?" I shook my head gently. No. Without that day, I'd never have known my own strength. Without being cast out, I wouldn't have this family or the chance to help so many others. He squeezed my hand, whispering, "I love you, Sarah. You turned pain into power." Leaning my head on his shoulder, a certainty pulsed through me. They once called me useless, barren, a failure. But I had been reborn stronger, freer, brighter than ever. I was no longer Sarah, the abandoned woman. I was Sarah, the woman who rewrote her own destiny. The day they cast me out, they called me a barren tree. But today, as I cradle my little son in my arms, surrounded by a home filled with laughter and peace, I know I am not just a tree, I am an entire garden. I have learned to turn pain into power, rejection into wings, and a broken life into a radiant journey of rebirth. If you have ever been struck down, remember this: they may dismiss you, but only you can decide how you will rise again. And I chose to become the strongest version of myself.